In this video, we're going to tie Russ Maddin Circus Peanut. The Circus Peanut was one of the first articulated flies out many years ago, but it remains super popular today because it just plain catches fish. And it's also the basis Kelly Galloup used for his famous peanut envy fly. It uses two hooks and only a minimum of materials. It's basically two woolly buggers, very similar to two woolly boogers tied together, so it's relatively easy to tie. So let's get started. The hook I'm going to use is a Gamakatsu B10S, and this is in size 4. And typically on articulated streamers, the rear hook is one size smaller than the front hook. But Russ Maddin notes that he often ties this fly with the same size hook. So we're going to do that in this video. And for thread, I'm using ultra thread and 140 denier in olive because we're going to tie this in an olive pattern today. And I'm going to start the thread just about an eye length back of the hook eye. Trim off my excess, and I'm going to form a thread base back to the bend of the hook, which is on this hook is just about halfway between the barb and the point of the hook. And then I'm going to move my thread back to just a bit in front of the hook point. Now for the tail on the back hook, we're just using extra select strung marabou, and this is an olive. And I want the tail to be about 1.5 times the length of the hook. So I'm going to measure that, and that's not quite long enough. So right about there, and then I'm going to transfer that measurement back to the bend of my hook. And I'm going to go ahead and trim off this marabou just to keep things kind of neat here. Take a few thread wraps, tie that marabou down, wrap it back to the bend of the hook, and get some of those fuzzies down. And then bring my thread back to about the hook point and let it hang there. Now for hackle on the fly, we're using just plain Chinese strung saddle hackle. You can certainly use schlappen if you want a little bit fuller body on this, but this is just plain saddle hackle. And here is a piece that I've already stripped all of that marabou, the fuzzy type fibers off the base of the tail there, or base of the feather rather. And I'm going to tie this in by the tip, and notice it has a curve, and I want that curve to be toward the hook shank. So I'm going to tie this in, about a 1/2 inch back on the tip, and just wrap that forward. No reason to trim that excess off. And again, bring my thread back to about the hook point. Now for the body on the fly, to add a little bit of flash, we're going to use standard Estaz, and I will put all of these materials in the description of the video. And this is standard Estaz in olive, and I'm going to strip a little bit of those fibers off so I can get to that bare thread base and grab it with my thread and tie that down. And then bring my thread forward to that beginning tie-in point just behind the eye of the hook. Now I want to wrap this Estaz forward. There's no reason to make touching wraps necessarily, so I can spiral it forward a bit, sweep it back so it won't quite lay down on itself so much. So I'm making slightly open spirals forward, I think about 6 wraps, and go ahead and tie that off. A few wraps behind the Estaz, a few wraps in front, and then trim that excess off. Now at this point we palm our hackle forward, but before I do that I want to sweep all those feather fibers up to where they're pointing out. Now I begin wrapping and palming that saddle hackle forward, and it will want to twist on you, so just kind of work with it. Try to keep those fibers pointing to the rear. If they want to lay down on each other, just pull them out a bit. And it looks like a mess right now, but we are going to straighten all this out. And when you get to the front, if you have a few left, just go ahead and wrap all those right at the front. And like I say, it does look like a mess, but we're going to straighten all of that out. Let's tie this off. And make a few wraps in front of that stem to ensure it stays in. And now we're going to sweep those feathers back and wrap back over the front of those feathers just a bit. And now they're laying nicely to the rear. You can see they were quite a mess as we were wrapping forward, but it all works out. Now we want a couple of legs on the fly, and so I'm using 2 crazy legs here, and I'm just going to put those right in front under the hook shaft, and I'm going to put them right in front of the thread. Take a couple of loose wraps, pull each section down on each side of the thread, or each side of the hook rather. Just pull it straight out. Take a few wraps, form a nice thread head and whip finish. Trim that off, and we want our legs to be about the same length as the tail. So we'll trim those. And of course you want to put a little head cement on the rear part of the fly, and the rear part of the fly is finished. Now I'll remove my rear section of the fly and lay it aside and put my front hook in the vise. And again, this is another size 4 Gamakatsu B10S. And our first material to tie on here is a medium-sized lead eye. And so I'm going to start my thread behind the hook eye and just make, a 1/4 of an inch thread base or so here. And bring my thread back to maybe just over a hook eye back. Now I'm using a medium eye here. We fish a lot of still water. I'm in Louisiana, so we fish a lot of still water. And these medium red dumbbell lead eyes, these are hairline, give it about the right sink rate for our still water. If you're fishing moving water or want to get deeper, you might want to use a large eye. So I flip my hook over, rotate it over, because I want to tie the eye on what would be the bottom of the hook. So I take a few cross wraps on my eye, one direction, straighten it out, take a few in the other direction, straighten it out. And then I like to take a few stirrup wraps, which is under the hook, over the eye, under the hook, over the eye, under the hook, over the eye. And that really kind of cinches that eye down a bit. And then once I get several of those, I will take some horizontal wraps on top of the hook shank, but under the eyes, just to really tighten that down. And then I can rotate my hook back upright in the vise and move my thread back to that bend of the hook, which again is about halfway between the barb and the point. And make a thread base back to there, and then let's bring the thread back to just behind the eyes. Now for articulation wire, there's any number of materials you could use. 20 to 30 pound mono works well. This is Senyo's intruder wire, and this is for hooks size 6 and larger. So I'm going to eventually fold this tip back over. You can super glue it and not do a reverse tie on this, but I like to do a reverse tie. So I'm going to line that tip up about with the eye of my hook, and I have that wire just on the upper side of my hook, and I wrap it all the way back to the bend and leave my hook hanging about, my thread hanging about the hook point. I next thread a bead, and this is a 3D bead in olive, and it's a fairly large bead. If you're using a smaller bead, you could use 2 beads on this fly, but with this large bead, I'm just going to use the one. And then I thread the wire through the bottom section of my rear hook, and then thread the wire back through the bead and pull it forward. We want to pull it forward till it has a fairly small loop behind the bead, not much bigger than a hook eye. And we don't want the bead, we want to pull the bead forward to where it's just touching the front hook, not tight against it, but just touching the front hook, which that looks about right there. So let's just grab that, wrap it forward. Let me get that wire on top of the hook. Make sure we cinch that wire down really well. And then I'm going to grab my small wire cutters and cut that tag end off the same length as the other piece. And then I'll take the tip of my fingers and I will pull that back, the tip of those wires back, and that folds it back where there's absolutely no chance of it coming off. Now, you certainly don't have to do this. You can use super glue here and not have to fold that back, but I like to avoid super glue when I can. So let's take our thread back to about the hook point, and I'm going to hook this in my material clip, the rear portion. And there's no tail on the front section of this fly, so the first material that gets tied in is our saddle hackle. And again, here's another piece that I've stripped the lower fibers off of. And I'm actually going to take a little small hair clip from Walmart cosmetics section, and I'm going to tie all that back out of the way so it won't be in my way. So again, the curved side goes toward the hook. So I'll wrap that down, leave my thread about the hook point, and then come back to my estaz, strip a few of those fibers off, and tie in my estaz, and take my thread to about the front of that wire, which is just about a hook gap behind my eyes. And just as I did on the rear hook, I want to spiral palmer this estaz forward and tie it off just behind the eyes. Now the difference here is I do not cut my excess off, because if you do, you just have to tie it right back in again, because we're going to use it here in a bit. And then just as I did with the rear hook, we pull all those feather fibers straight up where they're standing as straight out as we can from the feather shaft. And then we palmer that forward over the estaz. And again, it may want to twist on you, but that's fine. And as we get to the front, we just stack all that saddle hackle right up behind the eyes here. And tie that off. And again, right now it's sticking straight out, but we're going to take care of that with a few thread wraps here in a second. And get in there without cutting any fibers. Okay, I'm going to hold the estaz forward and sweep that saddle back and take a few wraps to form a little base and hold those fibers back. Then we go back to our crazy legs, and this is golden shiner color. Anything olive-ish which goes well with this would be just fine. So I loop it under the hook shank, take a couple of wraps, pull it down straight on each side, hold it to each side, and then take some tighter wraps, and let's sweep that back some more, because we're going to cover this up. There we go. Don't trim the legs right now, we'll come back to that. So at this point, take your thread and move it to behind the hook eye in front of the eyes, and we're going to figure 8 this estaz over those eyes. So I'm going to take it over the far side, keep my legs out of the way, over the far side, under the hook, up on the near side, across in front of the eyes, under the far eye, back and under the near eye, and then back to the front. And there's any number of ways to figure 8 that. Anything that gets that eye covered is just fine. Take a few thread wraps, tie the estaz down, and trim off the excess. Now at this point the only remaining thing is to whip finish and trim our legs, but actually instead of whip finishing I'm going to do some half hitches, because Estaz, when you tie it near the eye of the hook, it is almost impossible not to trap those fibers. So I'll do a few half hitches and a couple of double half hitches, and I'll do that instead of a whip finish on this, and it keeps my eye nice and clear. So I'll trim the excess off, take my little hair clip out, and at this point we want to trim our legs. So I take the fly out of the vise and turn it where I can see the hooks on the bottom, because I want to trim the front legs just about even with the rear of the back hook, because I don't want those legs fouling on that hook. So just about even with that, and there we go. And there is our Circus Peanut fly. This is really a great pattern. It's been around for many, many years, but it's still one of the most popular streamers out there. So it's easy enough to tie to where almost anyone can tie it. So I hope you'll give it a try. I'm sure it'll work for you.